The morning of December 24, 1944, Freyneux, Belgium, Corporal Jim Vance peered through the gunner's sight of his Sherman tank, the 76mm barrel clearing the cemetery wall by just inches. 4 German tanks crested the hill to the east, their silhouettes emerging from the winter mist. Panthers, 45 tons of sloped armor and a 75mm high-velocity gun that could pierce his Sherman from 2,000 meters away. Every American tanker knew the mathematics of death. 1 Panther could destroy 5 Shermans before they could close to effective range. Vance's hands steadied on the controls. His loader, back in the turret, had just completed a modification that morning. 5 rounds. Tungsten-cored, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. The German crews manning those Panthers had been taught that American tanks posed no frontal threat, that their armor was impenetrable to the standard 76mm rounds, that they could engage with impunity at ranges where return fire was mathematically impossible. What those German tank commanders did not know, could not have known, was that the tactical equation had fundamentally changed. The weapon that American ordnance experts had been desperately developing since August 1944 had finally reached the front lines in quantities sufficient to matter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German Panther represented the pinnacle of wartime tank design, developed in direct response to the Soviet T-34, which had shocked German forces during Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The Panther emerged from specifications issued by the German Army Weapons Department in November 1941. The design competition between MAN and Daimler-Benz resulted in MAN's design being selected in May 1942, with production beginning in January 1943. The vehicle that rolled off German production lines incorporated genuine advances in armor protection and firepower integration that set new standards for medium tank design. The Panther's specifications, impressed on paper and in initial German propaganda, combat weight of 45 metric tons, positioned the tank between American medium tanks, weighing 30 tons, and German heavy tanks like the Tiger I at 57 tons. Frontal armor of 80mm, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, provided protection equivalent to approximately 140mm of vertical armor. This sloped armor design, copied directly from the Soviet T-34, represented a revolutionary departure from earlier German tanks that relied on vertical armor plates. The principle was simple but devastating. Sloped armor increased effective thickness relative to the projectile impact angle, forcing incoming rounds to penetrate significantly more steel than the nominal thickness would suggest. Side armor of 40mm provided adequate protection against light anti-tank weapons and autocannon fire, but remained vulnerable to all Allied tank guns at combat ranges. The main armament, a 75mm KAWK 42L70 gun, represented the most powerful tank-mounted weapon in widespread service during 1943 and 1944. The designation L70 indicates that the barrel length was 70 times the caliber, providing the extended barrel length necessary for extremely high muzzle velocity. Muzzle velocity of 925 meters per second, with standard armor-piercing ammunition, provided penetration capability exceeding any Allied tank gun through 1944. At 1,000 meters range, the Panther's gun could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor, sufficient to defeat any Allied tank frontally. At 2,000 meters, penetration remained adequate to destroy Sherman tanks through frontal armor, while Sherman guns at the same range could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor. This enormous advantage in effective engagement range gave Panthers the theoretical capability to destroy enemy tanks before coming under effective return fire. This formed the fundamental principle of German tank gunnery doctrine: destroy the enemy from beyond the range at which he can harm you. The American response to the Panther threat evolved slowly and inadequately through 1944. The standard M4 Sherman tank that landed at Normandy in June 1944 mounted a 75mm M3 gun. This medium-velocity weapon had proven entirely adequate against German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks encountered in North Africa and Italy during 1942 and 1943. The 75mm gun could penetrate an estimated 88mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 90 degrees at 100 meters range, and 73 mm at 1,000 meters range when firing the standard M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round. Against early German armor, these penetration figures provided adequate capability. The Panzer III featured frontal armor of 50 mm, maximum thickness. The Panzer IV featured frontal hull armor of 80 mm on later models. Both vehicles could be engaged successfully by the 75 mm Sherman gun at normal combat ranges within 1,000 yards. The situation remained tactically manageable for American tank crews operating in North Africa and Sicily. German armor encountered in these theaters consisted primarily of Panzer III and Panzer IV variants that the Sherman could defeat frontally. The appearance of the Panther at Kursk in July 1943, however, fundamentally altered the tactical situation. American intelligence initially predicted that the Panther would be deployed as a heavy tank in limited numbers, similar to the Tiger I. Intelligence estimates suggested that American forces might encounter a handful of German heavy tanks alongside large numbers of Panzer IVs. These estimates proved catastrophically wrong. Statistical analysis of serial numbers on captured Panther road wheels allowed American intelligence to estimate German production figures with remarkable accuracy. Using this method in February 1944, U.S. intelligence estimated Panther production at 270 units for that month. German records examined after the war showed actual production of 276 Panthers in February 1944, validating the statistical estimation method. This production rate indicated that the Panther would be encountered in far greater numbers than previously anticipated. By the time American forces landed at Normandy in June 1944, German armored forces in France included substantial numbers of Panthers. 38% of German tanks in Normandy were Panthers, whose frontal armor could not be penetrated by the 75 mm guns of the US M4 Sherman at any practical combat range. The 75 mm gun could not penetrate the Panther from the front at all. It could penetrate various parts of the Panther from the side at ranges from 400 to 2,600 meters, but only when American tanks could maneuver into flanking positions. American awareness of the inadequacy of their tank armament grew slowly through brutal combat experience in Normandy. Tank units advancing through the Norman Bocage countryside encountered Panthers in defensive positions where German crews could engage at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. American Shermans advancing toward these positions found themselves under fire from an enemy they could not effectively engage. The standard tactical response involved flanking maneuvers to attack the weaker, side armor, close assaults to reduce engagement range, or calling for tank destroyer support. Each option carried substantial risk and frequently resulted in heavy American casualties. The Ordnance Department had been developing improved tank armament since before American combat experience with heavily armored German tanks. Original military specifications from September 11, 1941, for the M4 tank included provisions for mounting numerous weapons, including the 3-inch gun. Development of the 76 mm M1 gun began in July 1942, with testing completed and the weapon classified by August 17, 1942. However, mounting the longer 76 mm gun in the standard Sherman turret proved problematic. The existing M4 series turret was too small to accommodate the extra length of the 76 mm weapon. The Ordnance Department adapted the turret from the T-20 and T-23 medium tank development programs, suitably modifying it for installation on Sherman chassis. The 76 mm gun installation was standardized and introduced in production lines from February 1944. Vehicles fitted with the 76 mm gun received the designation suffix 76 mm to distinguish them from standard 75 mm armed Shermans. The first M4 tanks armed with 76 mm guns intended for combat were produced in January 1944. Tanks equipped with the gun began arriving in Britain in April 1944. The first batch of 130 M4A 176 mm Shermans reached Britain on April 10, 1944. Despite their presence and reports from the Italian theatre about encounters with Panthers, not one 76 mm Sherman landed in France on D-Day in June 1944. Major General Hugh Gaffey, of the 2nd Armoured Division, advocated against deploying the 76mm Shermans for several reasons. Available quantities were limited. Troops were not properly trained on the new tank gun. The logistics situation would be complicated by needing to supply different ammunition types for 75mm and 76mm armed tanks operating in the same units. General W.B. Palmer proposed that the 76mm gun be delayed for tank battalions and only introduced in specialized battalions, rather than mixing 76mm and 75mm armed tanks in the same units. Tank commanders remained reluctant to accept the 76mm armed Shermans. A report from June 12, 1944, stated that all of the commanders were reluctant to see the 76mm take the place of the 75mm tank gun in any quantity. The reluctance stemmed from several factors. The 75mm gun possessed superior high explosive performance compared to the 76mm weapon. The M48 high explosive round used by the 75mm gun contained 1.5 pounds of TNT, while the M42A1 high explosive round for the 76mm gun contained only 0.8 to 6 pounds of explosive filler. Since tanks fired high explosive rounds far more frequently than armor-piercing rounds in combat, the reduced high explosive effectiveness represented a significant tactical limitation. The 75mm also offered specialized ammunition, including white phosphorus smoke rounds that the 76mm lacked. Tank operations in Normandy focused heavily on infantry support missions, where high explosive performance mattered more than armor penetration. Commanders believed the 75mm gun remained adequate for defeating German armor. Previous experience with Tiger I tanks in Tunisia and Italy had shown that properly employed 75mm armed Shermans could successfully engage even heavy German tanks through flanking maneuvers and coordinated tactics. The belief persisted that tactical skill and numerical superiority could compensate for any deficiency in individual tank versus tank combat performance. These assumptions shattered during the breakout from Normandy and the subsequent pursuit across France in late summer 1944. American tank units advancing into open country beyond the bocage encountered German defensive positions at longer ranges. Tank versus tank engagements occurred at distances where the limitations of the 75mm gun became undeniable. Units sometimes suffered 50% casualties before even locating the source of enemy fire. The average combat range noted by American forces for tank versus tank action was 800 to 900 meters. At these ranges, Panthers could engage American tanks with near impunity while remaining effectively invulnerable to return fire. By July 1944, after unexpectedly high losses and the arrival of numerous Panthers on the American sector of the front, a call went out for M4s, armed with 76mm guns. General Bradley of 1st U.S. Army ordered as many 76mm Shermans as possible sent into France for Operation Cobra. 102 M4A 176mm tanks arrived in France and became a key part of the operation, marking their combat debut on July 25, 1944, the second day of Operation Cobra. The success of the operation helped validate the relevance of the 76mm Sherman. New 76mm tank models on the M4 and M4A3 chassis arrived in September 1944. However, the 76mm Shermans, now combat-tested, revealed another critical limitation. They still proved ineffective against the Panther's frontal armor. General Eisenhower, when hearing of the issue, expressed his frustration directly. "You mean our 76mm won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I'm the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." The problem stemmed from the ammunition issued with the gun. Using the M62A1 armor-piercing capped round, the 76mm gun penetrated 109mm of armor at 0 degrees obliquity at 1,000 meters, with a muzzle velocity of 792 meters per second. This represented improvement over the 75mm gun, but remained insufficient against the Panther's frontal armor. The 76mm gun could not penetrate the Panther's frontal glacis plate at any range. It could penetrate the Panther turret mantlet at very close range, typically around 91 meters, but only under favorable impact angles. The tactical situation facing American tank crews became increasingly desperate as German forces deployed Panthers in greater numbers. Sergeant Francis Baker, commander of a Sherman tank with the improved 76mm gun, described an engagement with German Panthers on November 20, 1944. Ordering my gunner to fire at the closest tank, which was approximately 800 yards away, he placed one right in the side which was completely visible to me. To my amazement and disgust, I watched the shell bounce off the side. My gunner fired at least 6 more rounds at the vehicle, hitting it from the turret to the track. This German tank, knowing that I possibly would be supported by a tank destroyer, started to pull away. I was completely surprised to see it moving after receiving 7 hits from my gun. Baker's experience illustrated the tactical nightmare facing American tankers. Even when achieving favorable positions with clear shots at side armor, the 76mm gun with standard ammunition proved unreliable. The psychological impact on tank crews was devastating. Men climbing into Shermans knew they were outgunned. They knew the German tanks could destroy them at ranges where they could not effectively fight back. They knew that even when they achieved flanking shots, their ammunition might simply bounce off enemy armor. Morale problems developed as tank crews lost confidence in their equipment. American ordnance experts recognized the crisis and accelerated development of improved ammunition. The solution lay in a specialized armor-piercing round that had been under development since spring 1942. The T4 high-velocity armor-piercing round, later standardized as the M93, represented a significant advance in armor penetration technology. The projectile employed an armor-piercing composite, rigid design. A full-bore, lightweight outer shell made of aluminum contained a slug of tungsten alloy. This design provided dramatically higher muzzle velocity compared to standard ammunition. The physics of armor penetration favored velocity. Kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity, meaning that doubling velocity quadruples penetrating power. The lightweight aluminum body allowed the tungsten penetrator to achieve much higher velocities than conventional steel projectiles of the same caliber. The M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second, compared to 792 meters per second for the standard M62 round. This velocity increase translated to dramatically improved penetration performance. The high-velocity armor-piercing round could penetrate 178 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, compared to 109 millimeters for standard ammunition. More importantly, for tactical employment against Panthers, the high-velocity armor-piercing round could punch through the Panther mantlet at 730 to 910 meters, compared to only 91 meters for normal 76mm ammunition. This represented a tenfold increase in effective engagement range against the most vulnerable part of the Panther's frontal armor. The first high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition arrived in the European theatre in August 1944. 2,000 rounds came by air initially. Though 20,000 rounds were ordered, production never kept pace with demand. The constraint was tungsten availability. Tungsten was imported primarily from China and was desperately needed for machine tools and other industrial applications essential to the war effort. The decision to allocate limited tungsten supplies to tank ammunition rather than machine tools represented a difficult strategic choice with significant implications for overall industrial production. Production of 76mm and 3-inch high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition remained constrained throughout the remainder of the war. Acceptances by month for 76mm high-velocity armor-piercing rounds were September 1944, 1,000 rounds. October 1944, 1,000 rounds. November 1944, 5,000 rounds. December 1944, 5,000 rounds. January 1945, 6,000 rounds. February 1945, 6,000 rounds. March 1945, 9,000 rounds. By February 1945, the average 76mm armed tank had received a total of 5 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. This represented an acquisition rate of approximately 1 high-velocity armor-piercing round per month per tank. A total of 18,000 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds reached Europe by March 1945, with 42% allocated to the 76mm gun and the remainder to the 3-inch gun used in tank destroyers. The severe shortage of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition created difficult tactical decisions. Tank destroyer battalions received priority for high-velocity armor-piercing distribution since their primary mission focused specifically on engaging enemy armor. Regular tank battalions, whose missions included infantry support and exploitation operations, received lower priority for the specialized anti-armor ammunition. Tank commanders had to carefully husband their limited supplies of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, reserving them for situations where engagement with heavy German armor was anticipated or unavoidable. Most tank crews carried perhaps 5 to 7 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, mixed with standard armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition. The tactical implications were clear. American tank crews could not rely on having high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition available for every engagement with German armor. They had to make difficult decisions about when to expend their precious few high-velocity armor-piercing rounds versus attempting engagement with standard ammunition or seeking alternative tactical solutions. The situation improved somewhat after the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945. The German offensive in the Ardennes brought Panthers and Tiger IIs forward in large numbers, creating intense tank versus tank combat that highlighted the critical need for improved armor-piercing ammunition. On January 29, 1945, 12th U.S. Army Group requested that all U.S. tanks arriving in Europe be the 76mm version, refusing any more 75mm Shermans. The criticism had shifted from concerns about reduced high-explosive performance to recognition that the 75mm gun was simply inadequate against German heavy armor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bulge transformed American understanding of the tank warfare challenge they faced. Before December 1944, German armor had been experienced primarily in sporadic engagements, with only minor counter-offensives at locations like the Battle of Ardennes. Tank crews held divided feelings about the 76mm gun due to its decreased high-explosive performance compared to the 75mm and the specialized ammunition options available for the 75mm that the 76 lacked. Proposals to completely replace the 75 with the 76mm gun were met with objections from commanders who valued the larger high-explosive round for infantry support missions. The German offensive changed everything. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, striking through the Ardennes forest with 3 armies, totaling 29 divisions. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces in the Ardennes sector, thinly spread along what had been considered a quiet front, found themselves overwhelmed by a concentrated armored thrust spearheaded by Panther and Tiger tanks. The weather prevented Allied air support. Fog and snow limited visibility. German armor attacked through terrain that American planners had considered unsuitable for large-scale tank operations. American tank units scrambled to respond to the breakthrough. 76mm armed Shermans rushed forward to stem the German advance. Tank crews who had carefully hoarded their few high-velocity armor-piercing rounds suddenly found themselves in the exact scenario those rounds had been designed for. Direct confrontations with Panthers at ranges where the improved ammunition could make a difference. The place, tactical mathematics that had favored German armor throughout 1944 began to shift, though most American tankers did not yet realize how significantly the equation had changed. Christmas Eve, 1944. Freyneux, Belgium. The village sat astride a critical road junction that German forces needed to maintain their westward momentum. Company D of the 7th Armoured Division's 31st Tank Battalion defended the position with a mixed force of Sherman tanks and Stuart light tanks. The Shermans included several M4A 376mm models that had received small allocations of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition in the weeks before the German offensive. Among these was Tank D-31, commanded by Lieutenant Myers, with Corporal Jim Vance serving as gunner. Vance had positioned Tank D-31 at the southeast corner of the church wall, placing the Sherman in a hull-down position where only the turret was exposed above the cemetery wall. The 76mm gun barrel cleared the top of the wall by just a few inches. This positioning made the tank a difficult target while providing excellent fields of fire toward the eastern approaches to the village. The increasing light of dawn allowed Vance to check the tank's field of fire and confirm that the gun could traverse across the most likely German approach routes. 4 Panther tanks from the 2nd SS Panzer Division approached Freyneux from the east shortly after dawn. The Panthers crested the hill overlooking the village, their crews confident in their armor's invulnerability and their guns' overwhelming firepower advantage. German tank doctrine emphasized engaging at maximum effective range, using the Panther's superior optics and gun to destroy enemy armor before closing to ranges where return fire became dangerous. The Panther commanders had been taught that American Sherman tanks posed no significant frontal threat. Intelligence briefings emphasized that Sherman guns could not penetrate Panther frontal armor except at extremely close ranges. What those German commanders did not know was that the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. The high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition that American ordnance had been desperately producing since August 1944 had reached frontline units, not in the quantities desired, but in sufficient numbers that some tanks carried several rounds. Tank D-31 held 5 high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds mixed with its standard ammunition load. Corporal Vance had been briefed on the new ammunition's capabilities. 1,000 meters effective range against Panther mantlets, dramatically improved penetration compared to standard rounds. The 4 Panthers continued their advance toward Freyneux. The lead vehicles had just cleared the crest of the hill when Vance acquired them in his sight. Fortune favored the American gunner in that critical moment. The Panthers had emerged from the hill crest with their flanks partially exposed, rather than presenting a perfect frontal aspect. The side armor of a Panther measured only 40 to 45 millimeters thick, well within the penetration capability, even of standard 76mm ammunition. More importantly, the Panthers were at approximately 800 meters range, well within the effective engagement envelope of the high-velocity armor-piercing rounds loaded in D-31's gun. Vance fired. The high-velocity armor-piercing round crossed 800 meters in less than 1 second. The tungsten penetrator struck the lead Panther's side armor and punched through, the lightweight aluminum sabot separating at impact, while the dense tungsten core continued into the tank's interior. The penetration was catastrophic. German tank ammunition stored in the sponson area detonated, blowing the turret off the Panther's hull. The crew had no time to react. One moment they were advancing confidently toward an American position. The next moment their tank was a burning wreck. The 2nd Panther in line reacted immediately, the commander ordering emergency evasive maneuvers. German doctrine emphasized that when coming under fire from an unknown position, tanks should immediately execute violent maneuvers while scanning for the threat. The Panther's turret began traversing, searching for the source of the deadly accurate fire. But Sergeant Rhys Graham's Sherman, Tank D-32, had also acquired targets. Graham's gunner fired at the 2nd Panther, achieving another side hit that penetrated and killed the German tank. The 3rd and 4th Panthers attempted to withdraw, their commanders recognizing that the tactical situation had become untenable. American tanks had achieved surprise, held superior positions, and demonstrated the ability to penetrate Panther armor. German doctrine stressed that when surprised at close range by enemy armor in superior positions, withdrawal took priority over attempting to fight from disadvantage. The Panther commanders ordered their drivers to reverse, while the gunners traversed turrets rearward to cover the withdrawal. But the retreat exposed the Panthers to additional American fire. Tank destroyer guns positioned in Freyneux engaged the withdrawing Germans. 1 Panther was hit and disabled. Another managed to escape over the reverse slope of the hill. The engagement at Freyneux lasted less than 5 minutes. 3 Panthers destroyed or disabled. 1 escaped. 0 American tank losses. The tactical result reversed the pattern that had dominated tank combat throughout 1944. American Shermans had engaged Panthers at medium range and achieved overwhelming victory. Similar engagements occurred throughout the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. At Vielsalm on December 19, 1944, an M4A 176mm Sherman from the 7th Armoured Division encountered a Panther at extremely close range in heavy fog. The German tank appeared suddenly from the mist, almost on top of the retreating American forces. The Panther's overconfident young crew were slow to react. One of the rearguard Shermans fired first. At that range, the Panther's armor advantage meant nothing. The American gunner aimed for the lower section of the curved gun mantlet, a known weak point in the Panther's frontal protection. The armor-piercing shell struck the mantlet and deflected downward onto the thin driver's hatch deck armor, exactly as the American gunner had intended. The shell penetrated the deck armor and plunged into the forward hull compartment, killing the driver instantly. The Panther lurched to a stop. Ammunition stored in the forward hull detonated, catastrophically destroying the tank. The German crew, who moments before had been confidently pursuing retreating Americans, died without understanding how their supposedly invulnerable tank had been destroyed so quickly. At other locations throughout the Ardennes, American tank crews discovered that the high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition gave them capability to engage Panthers at ranges previously considered impossible. Engagements at 600 to 1,000 meters that would have been hopeless with standard ammunition became winnable with high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The psychological impact on American crews was profound. Men who had felt helpless facing German armor suddenly possessed a weapon that could fight back effectively. Morale improved dramatically once tank crews realized they could hurt Panthers. The psychological impact on German tank crews proved equally significant in the opposite direction. Panther commanders throughout the Ardennes sector began reporting that American Sherman tanks were achieving penetrations at ranges German intelligence had insisted were impossible. After-action reports documented Panthers destroyed by frontal hits from Sherman guns at distances exceeding 500 meters. German crews, who had been taught that their frontal armor made them invulnerable to Sherman fire, discovered that this assumption no longer held true. The German response involved tactical adjustments and intelligence collection efforts. Panther crews were ordered to increase engagement ranges where possible, attempting to destroy American tanks from beyond even the high-velocity armor-piercing rounds' effective range. German intelligence officers examined destroyed American tanks, searching for evidence of new weapons or ammunition types. They discovered the high-velocity armor-piercing rounds in knocked-out Shermans, the distinctive tungsten cores clearly visible in sectioned ammunition. German technical intelligence reports documented the American ammunition innovation. The tungsten-cored projectiles represented exactly the type of weapon German forces themselves had employed earlier in the war, before tungsten shortages forced discontinuation. German engineers recognized immediately that the high-velocity armor-piercing design was highly effective, and that American industrial capacity to produce tungsten-cored ammunition in significant quantities represented a serious threat. German responses remained limited by resource constraints. Germany lacked adequate tungsten supplies to resume production of similar ammunition for their own guns. German industry could not increase Panther armor thickness without making the tanks even heavier and more mechanically unreliable. The fundamental German problem remained unchanged. They had designed technically superior weapons that their industrial base could not produce in adequate numbers. Their logistics network could not sustain in the field, and their tactical doctrine could not employ effectively given declining resources. American forces, by contrast, had designed adequate weapons that their industrial base could produce in overwhelming numbers. Their logistics network could sustain globally, and their tactical doctrine could employ effectively through combined arms coordination. The introduction of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition represented incremental improvement to an already functional system rather than a desperate attempt to fix fundamental flaws. American tank crews still faced significant challenges engaging Panthers frontally. The high-velocity armor-piercing round could penetrate Panther mantlets, but not the glacis plate. Successful engagements still required hitting relatively small target areas. The severe ammunition shortage meant crews had to carefully husband their limited high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, but the weapon gave American tankers a fighting chance rather than none. By war's end in May 1945, the tactical situation had evolved significantly from the desperate days of Normandy. 76mm armed Shermans constituted approximately 25% of American tanks in Europe by January 1945, with that percentage increasing through the final months of the war. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition production had ramped up, though never to levels that satisfied demand. Tank crews gained experience employing the new ammunition effectively, learning optimal engagement ranges and target points on German armor. More importantly, the systemic advantages that favored American forces throughout the war continued to compound. American tank production maintained high levels through 1945. German tank production collapsed under Allied bombing and raw material shortages. American tanks that broke down received rapid repair or replacement. German tanks that broke down were often abandoned for lack of spare parts or recovery capability. American tank crews received adequate training before entering combat. German tank crews by 1945 often entered combat with minimal training due to fuel shortages that prevented adequate practice. The Panther's technical sophistication, which German propaganda had celebrated as proof of engineering superiority, became liability rather than asset. The complex drivetrain, the temperamental engine, the hydraulic turret traverse system dependent on engine operation, all these sophisticated features broke down under combat stress. Final drives failed catastrophically at approximately 150 kilometers, requiring complete replacement. Maybach engines lasted perhaps 1,000 kilometers before major overhaul became necessary. Transmissions overheated during sustained operations. The vehicle spent more time undergoing maintenance than engaging enemies. Post-war analysis by military professionals confirmed conclusions that combat experience had already demonstrated. French forces operating captured Panthers from 1946 to 1950 in the 501st and 503rd Armoured Regiments documented every mechanical failure and operational limitation. Their 1947 technical report, titled Le Panther, became the definitive assessment of the vehicle's true performance under sustained military operations. The report confirmed the 150-kilometer final drive life, the 1,000-kilometer engine life, the maintenance difficulties, the fuel consumption, the crew discomfort, the tactical limitations. French engineers and tankers, initially impressed by the Panther's specifications, concluded that the Sherman was the superior combat vehicle when all factors were considered. They noted that while certain Panther features were admirable, particularly the gun and optical equipment, the overall package was unsuitable for sustained military operations. The British post-war evaluation reached similar conclusions. British forces captured numerous Panthers during the Northwest Europe campaign. After German surrender, British authorities commandeered a German Panther assembly facility at Hanover and forced completion of 9 additional Panthers using existing components and German technicians. These 9 British-built Panthers, completed in spring 1946, were intended for comprehensive testing. Standard British armoured vehicle acceptance trials were conducted on 2 Panthers and 2 Jagd Panthers. The trials had to be halted when the last working Panther damaged its transmission during a hill-climbing test. All other Panthers had already been cannibalized for spare parts or broken down from mechanical failures. The conclusive report, dated February 1948, stated that very little information of any value was obtained, noting the reason as the general mechanical unreliability of the Panther and Jagd Panther tanks. The high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition that had given American tankers renewed confidence during the Battle of the Bulge became standard issue post-war. When Sherman tanks equipped with 76mm guns entered service in Korea in 1950, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition was amply supplied to units. Over 576mm gun M4, a 3E8 tank, served in Korea. These 76mm armed Shermans performed well in the Korean War. Having better crew training and gun optics, American tankers had little problem piercing the armor of North Korean manned T-34-85 tanks when firing high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The M4, A3E8, destroyed 41 enemy tanks from July to November 1950 using 76mm high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. The ammunition that had been desperately scarce in Europe during 1944 and 1945 was now available in quantities adequate for any tactical requirement. Korean War tankers often carried 41 rounds of high-explosive shells, 15 rounds of white phosphorus, 7 rounds of high-velocity armor-piercing, and 7 standard armor-piercing rounds as their basic ammunition load. The tactical flexibility this ammunition variety provided allowed Sherman crews to engage any target type effectively. The legacy of the high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition and the Sherman tank's evolution during World War II extends far beyond the immediate tactical victories they enabled. Every American armored vehicle designed since World War II incorporates lessons learned from systematic analysis of captured German tanks and from American combat experience. The emphasis on reliability over raw performance, the focus on maintainability and logistical sustainability, the understanding that the best weapon system is the one actually available when needed rather than the one with the most impressive specifications. These principles trace directly back to intelligence analysis conducted during and immediately after World War II. Modern engineering students studying armor-piercing ammunition development learn about requirements, definition, the process by which operational needs drive technical specifications rather than technical possibilities driving weapon design. The high-velocity armor-piercing round succeeded because it addressed a specific identified tactical problem, the inability to engage German heavy armor at medium ranges with a technically feasible solution that could be produced within resource constraints. The tungsten shortage that limited high-velocity armor-piercing production illustrated the critical importance of resource allocation decisions in modern warfare. Tungsten allocated to ammunition was tungsten unavailable for machine tools. The strategic decision about optimal resource allocation involved trade-offs between immediate tactical needs and long-term industrial capacity. American planners made pragmatic decisions that balanced competing requirements rather than fixating on any single priority. German forces, by contrast, made strategic allocation decisions that prioritized technical sophistication in weapon systems over sustainability of production and operations. Tungsten that might have been allocated to maintaining basic industrial capability was instead directed toward exotic weapons programs that could not influence the war's outcome. The Panther represented this misallocation writ large. Enormous resources were invested in a technically impressive tank that could not be produced in adequate numbers, sustained in combat, or employed effectively given Germany's strategic situation in 1943 through 1945. The tactical innovation represented by high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition continued to influence ammunition development through the Cold War and beyond. Modern armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot ammunition used in contemporary tanks represents direct evolution from the composite rigid design pioneered in World War II. The principle remains identical: a dense penetrator core surrounded by a lightweight sabot that separates at muzzle exit, allowing the penetrator to achieve velocities impossible with full-caliber projectiles. Materials have evolved from tungsten to depleted uranium for improved penetration. Designs have been refined for optimal ballistic performance. But the fundamental concept that American ordnance engineers developed under desperate wartime pressure in 1944 remains central to modern anti-armor ammunition. The Sherman tank itself continued evolution far beyond World War II. Israeli modifications produced vehicles that fought successfully in the 1960s and 1970s against Soviet-designed armor. The M50 and M51 represented comprehensive rebuilds that retained only the basic hull while upgrading every system. Israeli Shermans mounted French cannons, American or British engines, improved suspension, modernized fire control systems, and enhanced armor. They proved that the fundamental Sherman design was sound enough to accept decades of improvements. The vehicle's basic architecture, the layout of crew positions, the ammunition storage, the drivetrain configuration, all proved adaptable to continuous upgrade. The Panther's design allowed no such evolution. Its complexity and tight integration meant modifications were impractical. The vehicle was optimized for its original configuration and could not adapt. This adaptability versus optimization trade-off represents one of the most important lessons from the Sherman versus Panther competition. Weapons optimized for specific parameters often cannot adapt when requirements change or when technological improvements become available. Weapons designed with adequate rather than optimal performance in each parameter often prove more successful long-term because they can continuously evolve. The Sherman represented adequate rather than optimal design. Its armor was adequate rather than optimal. Its gun was adequate rather than optimal. Its mechanical reliability was adequate rather than optimal. But every system was good enough, and the overall package could be produced, sustained, and continuously improved. The Panther represented optimization. Its armor was optimized for maximum protection. Its gun was optimized for maximum penetration. Its automotive systems were optimized for maximum power-to-weight ratio. But the optimization created a brittle system that failed catastrophically when any component exceeded design limits. The final drives optimized for a 30 to 35-ton vehicle failed rapidly when installed on a 45-ton tank. The engine optimized for maximum power output proved unreliable under combat stress. History delivered its verdict. The Sherman won. The Panther lost. Not in any single engagement, but in the campaign that mattered most. The production battle, the logistics battle, the sustainability battle, the reliability battle. American tankers understood this truth. They lived it. They fought in it. The high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition that gave them renewed confidence during the desperate winter of peace, 1944 through 1945, represented just one element of the systemic superiority that ultimately determined the war's outcome. 79 years later, the lessons remain clear and relevant to contemporary defense planning. Wars are won by systems, not by weapons. The side that builds the better system, even with adequate rather than superior weapons, defeats the side with superior weapons but inadequate systems. Technical excellence divorced from operational reality creates weapons that lose wars despite winning individual battles. The tank that looks magnificent in the museum, that impresses visitors with its massive armor and powerful gun, lost to the tank that worked reliably in the mud, that mechanics could repair quickly under field conditions, that was actually present when battle was joined. The German Panther crews who advanced so confidently toward American positions in December 1944 never expected that Sherman tanks would possess ammunition capable of penetrating their armor at medium range. German intelligence had assured them of their invulnerability. German propaganda had celebrated their technical superiority. German doctrine had emphasized engaging at ranges where return fire was impossible. All these assumptions proved wrong when tungsten-cored American rounds began punching through Panther mantlets at 800 meters. The psychological shock of discovering that assumptions about invulnerability were false proved as devastating as the physical destruction of tanks. German tank crews throughout the Ardennes offensive reported increasing reluctance to close with American armor, uncertainty about engagement ranges, fear that their protective armor had become inadequate. American tank crews, conversely, gained confidence from discovering they possessed effective weapons. The high-velocity armor-piercing round was not a perfect solution. Ammunition remained scarce. Hits had to be precisely placed. The Panther's glacis plate remained impenetrable. But perfect solutions rarely exist in war. Adequate solutions that arrive in time to influence outcomes prove far more valuable than perfect solutions that arrive too late. The high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition arrived in time, not in quantities anyone desired, but in quantities sufficient to matter. Tank crews who possessed 5 rounds of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition had 5 chances to destroy a Panther that previously could only be defeated through flanking maneuvers or tank destroyer support. Those 5 rounds represented 5 tactical options that had not existed before August 1944. The Battle of the Bulge represented the last major German offensive of World War II. German forces expended enormous resources in men, armor, and fuel in an operation that ultimately failed to achieve any strategic objective. Panther tanks that might have been held in reserve for defensive operations were committed to an offensive that culminated after 2 weeks. Many Panthers were abandoned when fuel supplies ran out. Others broke down from mechanical failures. The final drives failed. The engines seized. The transmissions overheated. The technically superior German tanks littered the roads of Belgium and Luxembourg, abandoned hulks that became monuments to the failure of technical sophistication divorced from logistical sustainability. American Sherman tanks, including those armed with 76mm guns and high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, continued advancing. They pushed German forces back to the Rhine. They crossed into Germany. They drove toward Berlin. Some Sherman tanks travelled nearly 1,000 miles during fighting from Normandy to Germany without breaking down, something German tanks were incapable of achieving. The reliability difference compounded over months of sustained operations. Tanks that consistently worked proved more valuable than tanks with superior specifications that consistently broke down. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.